Good morning. As we read chapters 43 through 45 of Genesis, we continue to hear the story of Jacob, Israel. I mean, it's some places that he still calls Jacob, and other places Israel. But the food that the 10 brothers had brought back has been used up. They're out, and Jacob, Israel, says to his sons, you got to go down there and buy some more food. And Judah, the son who in chapter 38 had been gone and then returned again, says to his father, the man said, unless we bring our youngest son, don't bother coming back. And of course, this brings heartache to Israel, to Jacob, because why did you ever tell him? Why did you tell him you had another brother? And I mean, it was very innocent on the brother's part because of the questions that Joseph asked, but Jacob, Israel, who knows how I'm going to refer to it, both names. But anyway, he was upset. He didn't want to send Benjamin, his youngest, because he had already, one son, Joseph, he thought was already dead. Just the two sons of Rebekah, Joseph and Benjamin, and one of those sons was gone, and he didn't want to send Reuben. But Judah says to him, there's no point of us going unless Benjamin goes with, because this man, he won't even see us again. He won't even let us into his presence. That's what he said, Dad. And so finally, Jacob says, okay, take double the money. In verse 12, take double the money with you. Carry back the money that was returned in the top of your sacks. Take some of the best of the crops that we have, a little balm, some honey, gum, resin, pistachio nuts, almonds. Take some of what we have that we can raise as a peace offering, but just to show that we aren't completely out of everything, but take some. And take your brother also, and be on your way, and may God Almighty grant you mercy before that man. He's just heartache that he's sending along. And then he says, as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. Because Judah has promised to his father, Jacob, Israel, that, if Benjamin doesn't come back, for whatever reason, I will take all the blame. I will take all the responsibility. Judah is saying to his dad, I will personally do my very best to be responsible for Benjamin and his safety and his safe return to you. There isn't any of this animosity or anger toward Benjamin. I mean, these other 10 brothers see how important, they all are to their father. But, so they go. And Joseph sees them coming. It's verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said, bring them into the house, slaughter an animal, make ready. And he prepares a fine meal for them. And he sits at the table with them. In verse 18, the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house. And they're afraid they're being brought there because of the money that had been in their bags, that they had been found out that, something was wrong, that, the gig was up. They didn't know what to think, but they were filled with fear and anxiety. Yeah, and we've all been there. I mean, we know what it's like to be filled with fear and anxiety and not sure what's going to happen. But they went with him. And they said to him, the first time we came, we opened our sacks, and here we had our money back. So we brought that along with more, plus we brought our food. We don't know how that happened. And Joseph says to them, he assures them, he says, don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in the sacks for you because we received the money we needed. The debt was paid. He isn't looking for anything that way. And then he brought Simeon out. Remember, Simeon had been the one brother left behind. So this is why the 10 brothers, or 9 brothers actually, 9 brothers came with Benjamin, making 10 brothers coming back because Simeon was already there. He had stayed at Joseph's demand. And, they made the presents and all of that. They gave him the nuts and all of that. They gave him the gifts that they had brought. And he asks he says, is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? And he says, yes, your servant, our father, is alive. And then he looked up and he saw Benjamin. He asked, is this your youngest brother? God be gracious to you, my son. Think about that. why, these brothers got to be just wondering what's going on here, with all of these questions and everything else. And then the Bible, Moses in his writings tells us that Joseph was so moved that he had to excuse himself at seeing his brother Benjamin, at seeing the trust that these other brothers had, the desperation of their father for the food that they needed and everything to be able to send his son. But he was so overwhelmed with emotion that he had to excuse himself and go to another room and shed some tears. It says he went to a private room and wept. And then he washed his face and came out again and said, "Serve the meal." And he said that they served him by himself and they by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves. There was separation there because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews. There was this clash yet of everything. He says it was an abomination for an Egyptian to eat with a Hebrew. And, we've mostly gotten past that segregation and stuff in our world today, thankfully. But it doesn't always happen. And it says when they were served, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any. So they ate and were merry with him. They had a pleasing meal with Joseph anyway. And then he commands the servants to fill the men's sacks as much as they can carry, put each man's money back in the bags, put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack of the youngest. He's setting them up. And of course we know what happens, and they take off and they go a day's journey, and Joseph sends men after them. And he says, "I treated you so well. Why did you rob me? Why did you take this?" And I mean, they have no idea what's going on, and they look, and the money's in the bags, and they're looking for this cup, and they find it in Benjamin's bag, and the brothers, and Judah especially, just whoa, how could this happen, and all of the conflict, I shouldn't say conflict, but the concern and the care and just how could this be, and Joseph has said, "The one who has possession of my cup shall be my slave, but the rest of you can go in peace to your father." And then it's in Benjamin's bag, and Judah steps forth, and he pleads. He says, "I pledged on my life to my father that my youngest brother Benjamin would return to him, because if he doesn't return, it will be the death of my father." Because of and Judah, pleads and begs and tells Joseph everything that's going on, and but they're doing as he said, and it's I have the father's sacrifice written in my book, and I have only son of the mother. I mean, it's we see so much similarity so we can see Jesus, the only Son of God, in so many of the things. Judah says he alone is left of his mother's children. So it's just those 2 boys, and Judah is pleading, and he tells the whole story of how, when our father says, "Go get us some more food," and we told him we had to take Benjamin, but I pledged my life. So please let me stay and let the boy go back. And he says, he says to his brother Joseph, "For your servant said to my father, if I do not bring him back, then I will bear the blame in the sight all of my life." And then chapter 45 starts out with Joseph being overcome. He says he could no longer control himself. And he says, "Send everyone away from me. Send all the Egyptians, all of the people of everybody else away." And so it was just Joseph and his brothers. And it says he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard. And Joseph says, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers just couldn't answer. They were just in shock, and rightly so. But then Joseph tells the story to his brothers of what happened. How you sold me into captivity, but through your evil deeds, God made something good happen. God was working in all of this, he said. You had intended to kill me, but instead you sold me into slavery. And God has worked through that, through Potiphar buying me, through my being able to interpret the dreams, through all of this, God has been working. So even though you were doing something evil, God made something good come of it. And, you know, that's, I think, where I'm going to focus on that, you know, that with all of the evil in the world, with all of the bad stuff that goes on, God wants good for us. He does. God's will for you and for me is for good, for happiness, for health, for well-being, for community, for family, to be able to know each other. And to think about Joseph here being reunited with his brothers and saying to his brothers, go. And Joseph then tells Pharaoh and everybody the story about this. And Pharaoh says, go and send for your father. Have him come down here, because this is only 2 years into the famine. There's 5 more years to come. Have Joseph, have your family come down. And not Joseph, have Jacob, Israel, your father, and all of his family. We'll send chariots, we'll send wagons, we'll send everything needed. But have your father come down, because Joseph was so honored and so respected in his position in Egypt. Even though he was a Hebrew, he had all of that. And Pharaoh was deeply grateful and says, have them all come. And the very last thing we see today in chapter 45, Israel, Jacob says, enough. My son Joseph is alive. I must go see him before I die. Think of the joy, think of the elation, think of the excitement in Jacob, Israel, of being able to go and again see his son, whom for roughly 20 years he had grieved as dead, but to know that his son was alive. So that's how Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, moved to Egypt. And we're going to learn more about that as we read on. So God's blessings today, and may you always remember God's plan for you is good.